Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again. I've made a lot of dreams videos over the past few years with a lot of information, but I've never brought it all into one place to show you all just how I go about sculpting with thermal efficiency in mind. This video is meant to change that, so here's a comprehensive look at how I sculpt. The first thing I like to do is put down a standard sphere edit at the origin, and I turn looseness all the way down. You end up with a 9% graphics thermal sphere. Then I'll back out of the sculpt and increase the tightness on that sculpt with the sculpture detail tool as far as it will go. This gives me a 22% sphere. I like to do this because whatever tightness level you work at is the limit for how tight you can go inside the sculpt. This way, if I want to really loosen up part of the sculpt and keep another part tight, I have the greatest range of looseness available without coming back out of the sculpt and adjusting it with the sculpture detail tool. When we're looking at the reporting on an object, what we're seeing is the sculpture data subcategory of the graphics thermo. This subthermo is a measure of the amount of flex needed to cover our sculpt. Being at 22% means we're using a lot for this one. But that isn't the only factor in the graphics cost of an object. Shared memory is another graphics subthermo and can also be a big contributor. The graphics cost you see is the cost of the most expensive subthermo in the group. Shared memory is the amount of memory consumed by tracking all of the spray paint and applied looseness edits you make in sculpt mode. That sounds straightforward, but it's a little more complicated. Right here I've applied a bunch of spray paint to the sphere, and when we check the thermo, all that work doesn't even show up in the shared memory subthermo. I believe the cost of these edits is influenced by the complexity of the shapes they're sprayed on and also how they overlap, interact, and blend. I'm going to add a single stamped edit to this with some blend, and we'll create some extra calculation to place in memory. Then we'll spray some blended spray paint all over this to create some more complicated interactions between the various edits that we're applying. The result is that we finally get that spray paint to show up in shared memory. Tracking shared memory while you work is important because the sculpture detail tool can't reduce this cost, and once your shared memory cost becomes greater than your sculpture detail cost, there is very little you can do to reverse it. All that technical talk leads to a practical examination of what you're trying to accomplish with a dream sculpt and what you're able to accomplish. It's important to note that the engine handles level of detail automatically, and this is determined at distances relative to the size of the object. The implication of this is that smaller objects in the scene space will appear to lose detail more quickly than larger objects when they're both near enough to each other to serve as reference. This generator on the right is about 8 feet high in scene space, and our colored blob is around the size of a human hand. Since the generator is roughly 30 to 40 times larger, it's going to have the same graphical fidelity at distance as the blob would 30 times closer. This presents a couple of different impacts. The first is that hyper detail on small objects is fairly pointless unless they're going to be seen close up. The second is the challenge of making a large object not look bad up close without being too expensive. It also means that when you expect a thing will be large in your scene, you need to sculpt it large. However, with all sculpts, consider distance. Here's a multi-story building part I made. This was sculpted with the intention of being 60 to 70 feet tall within a scene. However, this is meant to be something seen from no closer than street level, or roughly 20 feet. So while I need to create it in a large format, I can conserve resources and I can make it at a detail that doesn't concern itself with how it looks if you're standing right next to it. Notice it looks okay from a distance you might expect to view a building from. The generator has lost most of its detail and the blob is not visible. So if you have this blob in your scene and you never see it closer than this, any type of detail you might have added is a complete waste of time. We've talked about flex as sculpture data cost, but that isn't the only part of the shape of a sculpt. There is also a semi-transparent hull object that the flecks cover. Normally you don't really see this because it's a similar color to the flecks, or the flecks are so small that the gaps between them are indistinguishable. You can sneak a peek of the hull by loosening the sculpt a lot. The hull is the fuzzy part that doesn't have any flecks on it. You can also see it on a less loose sculpt by making the interior color different than the outer color and cranking the percentage up. This is important because you can use this fact to convey texture for free because all tweak menu settings are without extra cost. The main drawback is that this disappears from view pretty close up if your flecks are small, and I think there is a natural tendency to want sharp, crisp objects. However, with varying looseness or with applied looseness in the right spots, you can retain your sculpt shape while working with larger flecks away from the shape's edges in order to work the texture you get as a result. When you combine this with 16 different fleck types, impasto, ruffle, the ability to apply up to 8 simultaneous fleck types on a single sculpt, fleck combing, and the fact that each fleck type has a different emissive that the impasto settings affect, you can get a lot of different textures without trying to create them from edits. In addition to that, each set of surface texture parameters reacts slightly differently to the different materials looks that can be created with the materials sliders. Back to shared memory cost, one important concept is the conservation of edits. Please remember that if you are holding the trigger or button down while spray painting or applying looseness, that you are applying one edit per frame. This adds up very quickly. Sometimes it's more time consuming, but if you are tight on shared memory, a better idea is to plan ahead and apply those edits one at a time by tapping instead of holding. As we talked about earlier, because of the way LOD works in Dreams, you tend to lose detail on objects from a distance, and this is one reason spray paint and utilization of your available shared memory under the sculpture data cost is important. You can use spray paint to provide extra detail information at a distance because spray paint is more visible at a distance than surface contour details. I'm going to apply some spray paint, not very carefully, to all the cracks and details on this sculpt. One important part of doing this, check your sub-thermals often. If your shared memory cost goes over your sculpture data cost, you want to catch it fairly quickly because you can get yourself into a situation where you're spray painting for a while and then can't undo it far enough to get that cost back if you go over. I'm going to put this next to a puppet for reference, and when we compare, you can see that the details of those cracks are more visible at a distance. Now, it doesn't look as nice close up, and that's where taking care to place your edits and be more artistic comes in. The objective being to have an object that looks good at various distances it's likely to be viewed from in the scene. And real quick, I just want to give you an idea of how that shared memory accumulates fairly quickly over time. It's not super fast, but if you're in the zone and not checking your sub-thermals regularly, it can definitely get away from you. I'm being heavy-handed with the trigger as well, so you can get an idea of how much that contributes. When we come out of this second pass, you'll see that the shared memory is at 2%. That's not a big deal when your sculpture data cost is 20%, but let's say you were wanting to keep the cost of this thing under 2% for your scene. Now you have to hope and pray that you haven't applied so many edits that you can't undo them. If that's the case, the only solutions are to live with a 2% sculpt or start over from scratch. Coming out of Thermo reporting, let's take a look at some implications of our sculpture being reduced to 1% on the sculpture data Thermo. This is looser. We can see the inner color clearly. The spray paint is less apparent because that is represented on flecks as opposed to the color of the hull, which is the interior color, in this case black. You can see the interior color is not visible at this distance with this flex size, and that the spray paint does continue to reinforce form to some extent, but that extent is diminished. You may want to keep that detail farther out, or you may be losing too much of it due to looseness, so you might want to try a surface snapped painting overlay. Painting overlays have some great advantages, but they do cost in shared memory. With sculpts, shared memory can be subtle, but with paintings, it's basically just a measure of the amount of flex you use. The amount of shared memory a sculpt and a painting overlay consume combined as one element is a combination of both. However, the way this is shown in Dreams can be slightly confusing. Since Thermo reporting in Dreams is a ceiling value, you are seeing the next integer up from the actual cost. In the case of what we're making initially, our sculpt is reported as 2% and our painting is 1%. The total for both is 2%. That doesn't make sense unless you consider that the amounts are ceilings. What 2% means in this context is that the actual amount is greater than 1 and less than or equal to 2. For the painting, it is greater than 0 and less than or equal to 1. If both were small compared to their possible range, you could combine both and end up with a number less than 2, but greater than 1, which would show as 2. That's the case we have here. You can put a pretty good amount of flex into a painting without driving up the cost too far, but here as we add flex, we will see the painting's cost rising in our subthermal list, indicating that the amount is increasing. It's still not enough to trip that total shared memory cost over to 3% though. From a thermo standpoint, 99.9% of the time, the most thermo-efficient method of maximizing detail is to have the sculpture data cost and the shared memory cost of an element be equal. If you're planning to use a painting overlay, you want to leave yourself a little bit of headroom on shared memory when you're spray painting or applying looseness to your sculpt. Now let's look at some more ways to create surface texture effects using paintings or a second copy of a sculpt. Painting overlays are loaded with potential. You can give surfaces more than one material type this way. You can use glow to illuminate or lighten only certain parts of a sculpt. You can use transparency to create subsurface effects. The list is as long as all the possible combinations of sliders in the painting's tweak menu. In this case, I used a painting to make the rust colors on a shiny sculpt look dull, like real rust, while keeping the rest of the barrel shiny. You can also use a second copy of the sculpt in just as many ways. One way is to very slightly offset your copy and then change its materials type. This creates something akin to a bump map in polygon renderers and fools the eye to perceive depth where none exists. This technique depends on larger flex and the ability to see the hull, so it's best with looser sculpts and super close up. Perfect for VR. Here are some examples of different looks you can get from this just by messing with material settings, and keep in mind this looks different with each flex type and differences in impasto as well as many other factors like sculpture animation. Do keep in mind that there is an extra gameplay cost because you're using 2 sculpts instead of 1. Another similar option is to not offset the second sculpt, but instead play with differences in impasto, fleck type, and color to create detail that protrudes out of the original sculpt. You've probably seen this lots of times in the Dreamiverse but didn't realize it. This gives you the ability to create a solid base texture and then some fuzziness on top of that. Again, please consider that this does have an extra gameplay cost, but also please realize that none of this copying or tweak menu adjustment has any additional graphics cost. Which brings up the question, what can you not do to a sculpture or painting in this regard if you don't want to change graphics cost? The first thing you can't do is change the thing in sculpt or paint mode. All these tweak menu options incur no cost, no matter how many change. But any change in sculpt or paint mode, add or delete even one edit or fleck, and you create a unique thing with its own graphics cost. The other thing you can't do without changing cost is to use the sculpture detail tool. Normally this is not an issue because all copies of that sculpt change simultaneously when you do this, but there is an exception to that. If you bring an element into a scene, change its cost with the Sculpture Detail tool, and then bring another copy of the original into the scene, you will have two unique sculpts. One at the original detail and the other at the altered detail, and they will have independent graphics thermal costs. However, you can undo this after the fact. If you change one with the Sculpture Detail tool until they are the same detail again, they will link back up, and when you change Sculpture Detail of one after that, they'll both change. There is one very important condition on all that. In order to be able to do this, the sculpts must have come into the scene at the same orientation. If any sculpt in this scenario is rotated in any way when it comes into the scene, it will stay unique and never link back up with the others. This next part doesn't have anything to do with Thermo, but it's a very important part of being able to get the detail you want out of the edits you use in a sculpt. The thing that determines what effect positive and negative edits have is order of creation. Negative edits cut out portions of positive edits created before them, but not those made after. Positive edits overlay negative edits made before them, but not those made after. Without this, there would be no positive or negative edits except the last one. You've probably run into many instances where you put down a negative or positive shape a few steps ahead of where you later wanted it and ended up covering up or cutting a bunch of chunks out of it you didn't want. Then you have to go back and sometimes be very careful about fixing that. Something very important inside this whole concept is that you can copy edits, and when you do that, the copy goes to the front of the order. This means it will add or subtract from edits that the one earlier in the order couldn't. One implication is that you can rough out a bunch of stuff, hack away at it to improve your general composition, and then go back and reinforce form with copies of your original edits. But once you know about this, you'll use it a lot because it's not possible to plan out the commission of 500 edits in correct order, and you'll likely not be sculpting with that in mind anyway. So that encompasses my general low graphics thermal sculpting philosophy in Dreams and the methods I use to add surface detail to sculpts that look as good as possible up close and farther away, like you want for scene use. This is where I normally tell you about the next video, but at the moment I don't have anything else in mind. I'm thinking of some things I can do, and I am working on a game in Dreams, but it's going to take quite a bit of time to complete. In the meantime, I'll see you in the Dreamiverse, and let me leave you with one of the scenes I threw together with stuff made using this general sculpting philosophy. I'm still working on this scene, and when you look at it, keep in mind this is only 56% graphics thermo, 28% gameplay, so there is plenty of room to increase scene variety, room for expansion, and lots of room for logic and music if you wanted to make a game of this visual quality and scene size.